Alright guys, welcome to the class tonight. My Greatest Losses is the title, and I did a class like this last week where I went over a couple of my most memorable, or in my case, least memorable games of my chess career, and I prepared a couple more of those for you guys tonight. Must be some type of interest generated by the crowd who goes to a lecture where the focus is someone else's grave defeats and hardships. So thankfully you're all here to enjoy that. I decided to take one game which happened extremely recently to me, and another game which is a little bit older. But the first game that I'm going to start with is a game that I played myself against my opponent from Nepal named Rijendra, and this was a game played at the Olympiad last year, so 2018 Olympiad. Still quite a fresh tournament for me because I haven't played that many tournaments after the Olympiad. So in fact, it's one of my most recent tournaments, even though it did happen last year, quite some months ago now. But I thought it would be a great game to look at because not only was it a sort of astonishing defeat, but it also happened on quite a big stage. So I got to share my defeat with thousands of spectators, which is what everyone wants to do when they lose a game. Have everyone watch. And there were a specific amount of people who may not have seen that game, and perhaps they're sitting right here in the audience, and I would like to include them in the club of people who've seen this horrific and horrible loss, because my opponent was rated 1900. He was in the 1900s, and I was, at the time, I had achieved my Grandmaster title. I was just under 2500, so I didn't have many excuses. And I had a serious rating advantage over my opponent, about 500 plus points. And that's going to be a very big upset, maybe the biggest upset. In fact, I'm sure the biggest upset of his career. And since becoming a GM, you don't expect to lose to a player below 2000. When you're not even barely 1 year into being a GM. You're supposed to go have a long 30-year career and then maybe drop a game or two to some young talent. But that didn't happen. My opponent was talented, but he wasn't young. So I was definitely caught off guard, and I'll show you the game here because it was the first round of the Olympiad. So you got your team colors on, travel all the way to Georgia, around the world, not Georgia, in the States. You go all the way there, you play your first game against Nepal, my first game in a while, all the nerves are there, all the excitement's there, and then you lose. So it's not very fun. So, because it's not very fun, for me, I'm hoping that this will be fun for you. So yeah, I was playing white, had the white pieces, decided to start off with c4. Basically, I'm a little bit out of shape. I haven't studied chess as much as I'd like to, or just don't have the time to. So usually what suffers when you don't have enough time to study is at the higher levels is your openings. You get a bit lazy with what you play because you don't want to enter some of the mainline theory. You feel like other people would know that better than you. So I decided to play c4. And maybe we would transpose to a d4 line, but I usually play d4, and I decided to start with c4 just to see what he did. Turns out he plays c5, and so I thought, okay, we're going to go for e4 and get a Maroczy bind position like this. And whether you know or not, the Maroczy bind is just always this sort of slight plus for white, and really an enjoyable position. So not only was my opponent so much lower rated, but I had this position that I would be comfortable with against the strongest player in the world. I mean, this is sort of the best opening position I could ask for. So I was really happy with my opening, and then I have even less excuses. So we're playing the Maroczy here, knight c6, bishop e3. I'm trying to avoid playing the move knight takes c6 if I can. Black sort of plays b takes, fixes his structure, and of course with rook b8 and this bishop here, my pawn on b2 is a little uncomfortable. So trying to support that knight in the center with my bishop and develop the rest of my pieces basically as you see in the game. Now my opponent also doesn't really commit too many mistakes in this game, so it really comes down to me. After knight f6, which is one of the normal ways to start, black has one line which he can play after knight c3 instead of the move d6. Sometimes people try this line, knight g4, with the idea, well, that is a free knight, but then we can take that knight in the center. And after queen d1, just to stop knight c2 there, and to get out of some d5 move by black. Black plays, let's say, knight back to c6, and we've got the same position except a pair of knights have been traded. So sometimes black goes for this line, sometimes he just plays d6, keeps all the pieces on the board. In this particular game, my opponent decided to just play the main line, which is just, let's say, d6 here. Again, if I take, black's always taking with the pawn, so the pawn on d6 is there to stop white from playing e5 in a lot of lines, like knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, e5 can be annoying for this knight on f6. So bishop e2, just getting developed normally here. Eventually, I may play, let's say, pawn f3, queen d2, castle, and then just bring the rooks into the middle of the board. And when you have this Maroczy structure, and when I say Maroczy, of course, what I'm referring to are the pawns in the center of the board that sort of characterize it this way. As long as I have these pawns here, it's really hard for black to break with b5 and d5. It's also not in black's interest to play e5, because then the pawn on d6 would be a target for my queen or any of my pieces on the open file. So really the idea is that I want to make black's life difficult in terms of breaks. So I want to prevent b5, I want to prevent d5. e5 is not possible, and f5 is a little bit difficult to achieve because, of course, we've got that knight there, and I've also got my knight and my pawn watching that square. It's not like a King's Indian where you just play f5 and attack. So all these things considered, this is what makes the Maroczy such a pleasant position to play for white. Now, not to say that it's a bad position or even shouldn't be played for black, but it's definitely that slight plus that I think any strong player will be happy to take against anyone else. So I couldn't complain out of the opening. I castled, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and bishop e6. One of the sort of main ways to play as black is also this move, bishop d7, which could be included, let's say, before the last move, bishop d7. Let's imagine I played queen d2, and in similar style, knight takes knight, bishop takes, bishop c6. And this is the other popular way to play. Bring the bishop to c6, hit that pawn. Let's say that f3 gets played. Now black might continue with knight d7 and try to trade these bishops. Now, believe it or not, white sometimes with the bishop on e3, queen d2 wants to play bishop h6, but in this particular case, this is an example of when I would actually want to keep that bishop and not trade it. So usually play continues bishop e3, a5 to stop b4, so black is preparing knight c5, and black wants to put the knight on c5, get the queen developed. He's got a strong bishop and trying to play like he has control of the dark squares there. So this is actually what I was expecting when I saw the opening. It's, I think, by far the main way to play. And although he took my knight first, I wasn't sure if he was just going to try to transpose with either like a5 or bishop d7, bishop c6 here. So I thought it's still reasonable that he might play bishop d7. Instead, he played bishop e6. So a little bit different. Definitely not something I'm afraid of dealing with, because without the bishop on c6, there's less pressure on e4. And he's deciding to put a little more pressure on c4, maybe rook c8 next. Hitting that pawn, I'm going to have to play b3. And a good move to play before b3 a lot of the time is like rook c1 or queen d2. Make sure that knight's protected and there isn't any trickery on the long diagonal. So after bishop e6, I decided to play rook e1. And my only explanation for rook e1 as opposed to f3 is that I was actually maybe considering some positions where I don't move my f-pawn to f3. Instead, I leave it on f2, just play bishop f1. And if we look at, for example, a position like this, bishop f1, let's imagine black does the same thing. I mentioned earlier, usually we don't want to trade these pieces, but I was curious about a position where maybe I trade, maybe even give this check and play something like rook e3. Maybe I want to play my f-pawn up the board, but there are also some ideas like putting the queen back and somehow trying to get the queen to h6 and sneakily use the rook on the third rank as well. So I guess because I had so recently studied some position that looked something like this, I had this master plan in my head that I was going to play without my f-pawn on f3, or at least try to. So that is my only explanation for rook e1. Otherwise, queen d2, f3, b3, rook c1, all these moves make a lot of sense here. So it's not to say that my move is the best or even one of the best. a6 was what he decided to play. Okay, just followed my plan, bishop f1, rook c8. So he was playing it a little bit different than I was used to. He didn't play for this a5 with knight on c5. Instead, he's just attacking my c-pawn and maybe has the idea to play b5 in some cases. So sometimes when you play b3 really early, you run into positions where this knight might be a little loose with all these pieces attacking. So I think that, if my rook was on c1, I'd be more confident playing b3. But this pressure on c4 caused me to play in this position knight d5. But by no means was I viewing this move as a concession. I was actually quite happy to play this. I thought with my rook placed so well on e1 that almost any exchange on d5 would be good for me. Now, if the knight takes, then I would most likely take back with the e-pawn, and I would try to use this rook on e1 and put pressure on this pawn. So the bishop would move, let's say. We do this, give a nice check on d4, centralize my queen. Let's say king g8. I could do something crazy like g4. I could do something a little less crazy like maybe h4, h5. I could also just play rook e3 followed by rook e1. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on this pawn, and I think that the pressure on the e-pawn is actually enough of a reason that I should be better here. So I was comfortable trading all these pieces, but just having that classic Maroczy position where after knight d5 you take with the pawn and e7 becomes weak. Now the same thing happens if the bishop takes. If I take with the pawn here, although black can sometimes achieve positions like this, let's say, where you get the knight and you want to put on c5 and say that the bishop is no good, that it's a bad bishop, and that the knight is actually a strong knight on the dark squares. Now, although this is possible, again, I think you'll find that the dark squares are just too weak. Say rook e3, rook e1, a lot of pressure here, and with this h-pawn coming up the board, the queen operating on the king side, it's really hard for black to do anything because you put that knight on c5, let's imagine. a5 to stop b4. Now let's say that you get that knight there, you know. Clap, clap. Congratulations. Prettier by the minute.
Okay, we're good.
But the reason that, it's not actually doing that much, it's just standing there and looking pretty, is because black doesn't have any threats. He just has a nice looking knight. Me, I'm actually creating threats. I have enough pressure here that I'm keeping the queen and rook tied down, and simply a move like h5 is so hard to deal with because taking always gets mated. Queen on h8 next move, and if I don't take, not only could white do this next, I could play h6, and I'm actually going to create a lot of threats against the black king here. So these types of positions are the ones I was going for. Always taking with the e-pawn, e takes d5, opening up my rook, and putting pressure on e7, no matter what minor pieces would be left over. So after knight d5, my opponent played knight d7. And sort of after the lines that we just looked at, in hindsight, maybe even during the game, I think I thought that this was a reasonable move. Earlier we were discussing that knight d7, trading the dark square bishops, was actually a major plan that black had. So I could understand knight d7, so I decided to take, and here I decided to play a4, preventing b5 for good, and again saying that if you take, I'm going to take back, and I know that I have all these weak dark squares, so even the move a5 can sort of, fix all these pawns on light squares. b3 it's fixed, but I wanted to do the same thing, somehow double my rooks on the e-file, maybe queen d4, and start pushing this h-pawn, and I was sort of confident in handling those types of positions where I'm attacking. So he played a5 in reaction, and notice he's not playing bishop takes knight. He didn't play bishop takes knight yet, and so I don't have the exact same rook e3, h4, h5. I can't just go crazy attacking maybe until he decides to make that trade. So I decided to check f6 and rook e3. So h4, h5, maybe I'm going to go for that, but rook e3 I thought was nice because maybe I'll double, maybe I'll even swing to b3 in some crazy variations, but I think the rook on e3 is sort of well placed. So I thought I'd put it there and then think about it after. And also, I did want to play a move like b3. So I'm just going to make a nothing move for black because I did want to play something like b3 where it just watches everything, and the only weakness in my position is maybe that pawn on b3. He could attack it with knight c5. So I liked that the rook was taking care of that pawn, and that now my rook on a1 was free to join the game, join the center. After rook e3, my opponent played bishop f7. And it seemed to me here that he truly had no intention of playing bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight here is also 10 times worse than it was before, because now we're staring at a position where they've played f6. So now that pawn on e7 is truly a sitting duck. e5 is never possible because I just take it. And if you don't play e5 and you just leave that pawn there, I mean it's very, very uncomfortable to defend all the time. Now you wish that maybe you could stick a knight on e5, but f4 is always going to be kicking the knight out, and the pawn on e7 is just too weak. So those are the positions I was counting on. But bishop f7, I played my b3 move, knight c5 was played, hitting my pawn, and okay, I decided, well, I'll just move my rook. I played the move rook b1. I think I had a lot of ways that I could have played this position, like even just rook e1 was an option, but what I found very annoying here was my desired rook e1. I was thinking, wait a minute, what if my opponent plays e6? Kind of a strange move. He's sort of playing connect 4 here and winning. And after knight f4, well, I would lose my knight to e5. And also, after knight c3, well, I would lose my pawn on b3 to knight takes b3. So all of a sudden, I was in a position where I felt like I was compelled to play rook b1. And, in the Maroczy, I guess there's not many times where white is almost forced to play a certain move. And I felt a little strange at the board when this happened. I just felt like, well, rook b1's not a bad move, so I'm fine to play it, but it's not usual that I'm sort of forced to play these moves, that black is sort of kicking me out and forcing me back. I'm playing a bit of defense. So I was at this point where I sort of realized things maybe were not out of control, but maybe on the wrong trajectory, going down the wrong path. He still followed up with e6. As we looked at earlier, I lose my knight if I play knight f4, so I have to play this. Although I wasn't disappointed because knight b5 is an idea, and the knight does sort of protect everything from c3. And he played queen b6 here. And he's not threatening to play knight takes b3, right? Because I'm pinning that knight there, and I saw that, and so I was comfortable. And in this position, I thought, well, if knight takes b3 isn't a threat, he played this e6 move. He still has his bishop, which is not looking great on f7. So I thought maybe now is the right time to continue my attack on the king side. I always wanted to play h4 in this game. And I can't really move this rook from b1. Moving this knight, I don't really see the benefit of like knight e2 or anything like that. And so I decided, okay, I don't see his threats. I'm just going to play h4, h5 and continue from here. And was actually this next move I played, which cost me, maybe cost me the game right here, although I never expected just losing a pawn to a 1900 that he would have necessarily the technique to put me away, but he did. After playing h4, I blundered kind of like an elementary tactic in a way, but a tactic that completely escaped me in this position because I had never seen this exact orientation of pieces, and I wasn't used to this tactic in this opening, not at all. But the tactic is the same as in the opening when someone is pinning a knight with a bishop, and there's a bishop right behind the knight. So it means I can move my knight to a square that protects my bishop and then capture back. The tactic being knight a4. So then I want to take his knight, but my queen is hanging. And if I want to take his queen and then take his knight, well, he's got it all worked out because his knight then captures back and gets out of trouble. So if you think back to the opening, let's say if this was a light squared bishop and that was a dark squared bishop, it's really common to see someone pinning a knight and then later on forgetting that if they don't defend that bishop, or in this case that queen, there's often a sacrifice like this where you come right back and take and get your knight out of danger. So I just completely sort of forgot that this was possible. And it definitely came as a big shock. I mean, it was my first game at the Olympiad, you know, sitting down, touching 3D pieces again after playing online for a little while, and just blundering a tactic that I would expect myself not to blunder most of the time. And the worst part is that it either forces the exchange of queens or the exchange of knights. So it's just more pieces start vacuuming off the board as well, which is also, again, not what I want. So it's like that really unfortunate situation where you know, you're not only losing material, but there's trades that have to come with it. So it's the worst of everything here. I decided that my best chance was to take the queens off and say that the knight on b6 was not very well placed, and that, you know, it would take him a while to get it back here, and he's got this pawn hanging. Maybe I can pressure the d pawn as well. So I have to say, from this point, rook a1, I honestly did not expect to lose. I didn't. I thought that that I would maybe draw. Now, I reserved some hope that I might win the game. I think everybody in chess naturally reserves that hope when you're calculating or anything like that. But I almost 100 or very close to 100% didn't think I was going to lose because, quite honestly, at 1900, to have the ability to outplay a grandmaster is quite impressive. And that's why I was so impressed by this game overall, is that he really demonstrated some accuracy with the next part of his game, and also just even in the end game. When the time got low, I mean, he was just consistent the whole way. I felt like he didn't make any serious blunders from here on out, and I thought that was very impressive for his rating. So he defends the pawn, which maybe is not that impressive. Knight b5 attacking the next pawn. So okay, he defends it again. We're still in a position that you know, he's just making reactive moves. It's nothing special. So after knight there, rook c8, I go knight back with the idea that, of course, I will take a draw. I'm down a pawn. If he goes back there, I'll play knight back to c7. And if he plays rook a7, I can even go knight back to b5. Rook a6, knight back to c7. So his rook doesn't have anywhere in the a file it can stay safely. So it has to stay on the c file. But then after knight back to b5, I'm hitting his a pawn. So again, he plays a nice move here. It's a4. He gives up this weak pawn in exchange for a different one. And there's not much I can do. I'm sort of forced into this line. And then what I decided to do was, okay, there's his extra pawn. It's sitting on d5. It's protected by the bishop, so he's definitely a clear pawn up, no question. But I thought, okay, I'll blockade the pawn on d4 with my knight. Maybe in some moment I'll take this guy and play like a knight against bishop. Wasn't sure about that, but I thought at the very least I will blockade the d pawn with my knight, and I should have some counterplay maybe against this b pawn on the open b file, or maybe I can pressure the d pawn by bringing my rooks to the d file. So again, I was sort of happy with how this developed. So we go forward a little bit, f3 to stop rook e4. Thought I'd get my king out, maybe my bishop out. And again, this rook is sort of doing double duty here. Rook c8. Thank you. Rook c8. And we sort of reach this position. Now, I'll just mention that we're on move 34. Often in when you're looking over games, it's important to realize sort of when you get close to move 40, because that explains a lot of repetitions of moves or a lot of blunders, because you can sort of assume that players are in time pressure. So that explains why in this position that we sort of repeated here. And then if my opponent would play one more time rook c7, well, it would just be a draw. But he doesn't. He plays knight e5. And the reason that, of course, we shuffled there was that he wanted to just get closer to move 40, so he wouldn't blunder anything in time pressure. So not only was my opponent playing like very well, very accurate, holding on to his extra pawn, but he was also like handling time pressure very maturely. You know, this is a smart decision. Waste some moves by repetition and then just play a different one. So he plays knight e5. He has an idea to maybe, in some cases, try to arrange knight c6, which would finally get rid of that blockade. I played rook b5, and although he got a trade of rooks here, I thought that I still have good pressure against both of these pawns. Let's say I left a rook on b5. It looks like if I'm attacking both those pawns, it's really tough for black to make progress. So finally, after knight b5, knight b2 was played. And initially, I was actually ready for this move. I thought, okay, I'll play a5. Get my pawn on a dark square, and this move bishop e2 was played to take away all the squares the knight wants to go to. So if the knight wants to get out, it's going back to c4 or maybe a4, where I'm not sure where it's going after that. So it was actually, again, at this point, then once again, I found myself very impressed by my opponent. He played rook d7, and I played king e3, and after d4 check, I'm curious. Maybe if anyone here can tell me why I eventually realized, sadly, that knight takes d4 by me is not a good move. Because I had planned to play knight takes d4. Why is it no good? Because this was almost the nail in the coffin for me. It's like, I thought that his pawn had to stay on d5 and that I would have a dark square blockade. And because I didn't, then the pawn starts to roll all the way down the board. As you can see, that knight on b2 is so well placed, controlling not only the next pawn move, but also the queening square. So this pawn just starts to take off down the board. But I was planning to take it. So what's wrong with this move? Yeah? And then king e4? And then king takes f4? I mean, f4 is the move that, you know, doesn't feel right, because if king takes f4, I lose my knight on d4. King e4, though, was, this was what I calculated. And I stopped my calculation here. And I said, if rook check on e7, then king takes on f4. And now his rook is not back on d7, where it could take my knight. So I thought, okay, I'm solving my problem. That's what I calculated. I stopped there. He calculated a few moves further, which is why he played d4. So what did I miss in this position? Yeah. Rook takes e2 is really annoying. Now the knight takes, and I just lose my rook. And we're just down a piece here. And I don't even have, like, you know, a rook check to get my rook out of the check here, out of harm's way. So everything just works for him. But again, if I'm down a pawn, it makes sense that tactics work for my opponent, not for me. Chess is a pretty fair game. If I've been on the back foot the whole game, it's not very logical that I deserve all the tactics in the world to just be working for me. So that wouldn't be fair. So they work for him. Of course they do. d4, this is what I missed. I thought I could take that pawn. He played it sort of quickly and with some confidence that showed me his calculation skills were also good. So, I mean, he found the tactic to win a pawn earlier, seemed to handle time pressure very well. All of a sudden, he's calculating better than me. Now I thought, okay, this is where we lose the game. This is where I was not sure, but I felt that there were real chances to lose, because look how far that pawn crept up the board, all because I thought I was stopping it at one checkpoint, But if you break through that, then it just goes all the way. Knight e3 hits the bishop, prepares d2, and I thought king d2 was the only move. And instead of taking my pawn here and just sort of winning another pawn, again, he plays the move that's the most forcing. After d2, bishop b3 is a threat. I mean, a winning move. So I simply have to protect it. Rook d5, and now he wants to take my pawn on a5. I can't do anything about that. If he took it right away, though, I would take on d2. So he goes here, threatening to give the same check. And again, don't have a choice. I can't allow it. But now he can take, and I can't play king takes because now my knight's hanging. So again, even this series of moves I thought was very accurate by black. Knight b1, rook a4. Now again, after knight b1, if he played rook here, let's say, the reason this is a natural move is because I can't play king takes or knight takes. But what I was planning was rook here, hitting his pawn, threatening to take on d2. And what he decided to do was play rook a4 so that, well, if I move my rook somewhere else, then after the rook comes down here, I don't have my nice rook b4 move. And if, let's say, I decided to take, he was confident that this was winning, and I'm inclined to believe him. Not only can he fix my pawns on light squares here, which is very, very good for black, but he's got an outside pass pawn, and this pawn is looking a little weak. Probably the king will have some sort of avenue into my king side here where he's going to take all my pawns. So I thought rook a4 was, again, a really nice move. I decided to play rook c7. Okay, if here, then I just take on b7. Again, a nice move, bishop c6. I don't really sort of have time to go pickpocketing down here because rook a1 is going to win the game. So now I took, and the rook on a4, so well placed, takes on h4. Now h7 is protected. So you can see my frustration is that between the two of us, one of us was playing like a GM, and it wasn't me, which was quite frustrating. My opponent was just playing very well. He was covering everything, watching all the counterplay. This part of the game is just a little bit of sort of technique, conversion. I'm down 2 pawns here, plus everything else that's wrong with the position. So just go a little bit fast through this because all these moves are just me sort of trying to drum up some counterplay and him watching the counterplay with every move. Even this moment here after rook d6, there was no way for me to take this pawn safely. If knight takes, then king f6, I thought, and I'm going to lose one of these pieces. And if rook takes, well, then rook takes, let's say, knight takes, and I thought that this king just goes to d4, and I'm not sure how I can stop this pawn going down the board. So I was a little bit concerned in a lot of lines here that I would just be losing. So continuing with the game, everything's sort of protected for him. He's doing a great job stopping my counterplay. Finally, I have this idea here that I'm trying to get his king like boxed in, and I accomplished that with king e5. So, I'm starting to get excited here, right? Knight e4 is checkmate. But, of course, my opponent, too good, has this one covered as well. He gives up his rook. And even here, I had my dreams that this might be a draw. But after he gets that pawn going, it becomes very clear here that it's just not going to work, as there's too many pawns queening for my rook to stop. And after he makes a queen, I had maybe one last, candle-lit hope. Rook b5, take here, somehow try to get my rook near my pawn here, maybe on g4, try to say that I have a fortress. I don't believe I do, but that was the last try. But again, with pinpoint accuracy, my opponent can't go here or here or here because of queen f1 check or queen e2 check winning my rook. So I'm forced to go here. Another thing is that, let's say in this position, g5, I can't take the pawn, of course, because many checks will win my rook. And what he does is he forces me away from my own pawn and wins just from that. Now he's going to win my pawn, and he's got this guy going to make a queen. And so I decided to resign here, where maybe it's been lost for a while, but he finally just demonstrated complete technique and got my king away from the pawn. Now there's no hope because he's going to get another queen. I'm going to have to sacrifice my rook at best, and that's that. So, I mean, basically my opponent won a pawn and then never turned around. Like, he never looked back. He was able to handle all the counterplay. I mean, I was trying my best to go for repetitions, try to win some material back. I never thought that it was an easy conversion up until probably the critical moment was when I missed d4. But even still, in that critical moment, he was up to task. He played d4. He calculated it out. And I guess I never stopped being impressed. Well, this is all retroactive. I can definitely tell you during the game, I was not putting my opponent on a pedestal. Wasn't too impressed with him during the game because I was trying to find the positive side where maybe I had a chance. But after the game, I sort of realized that he actually just played quite incredibly and didn't give me a chance to drum up any counterplay or come back from losing this pawn. So I felt like after I lost the pawn that he nearly played a flawless game, and I find that for my opponent rated just 1900 something to be very impressive. So this was like a big shock, obviously the worst way to start the Olympiad, representing your country. We're playing Nepal, huge rating underdogs, 500-600 points deficits on like almost every board, and to lose, I mean, we still won the match, of course, because everyone else won their games, but it's just a knock on my chest that should never happen, really shouldn't happen. So this was definitely up there with one of my most recent memorable losses, and my opponent actually went on to, I believe, achieve some sort of title in the tournament because his Olympiad result was so good. I think he performed around 2,400. So he didn't just do that to me. He did that to everyone else in the tournament. And he ended up achieving some title, whether it was Candidate Master or FIDE Master, I can't remember. But he actually earned a title awarded to him because his performance was so good in the Olympiad. So again, the other weird thing about it was that he wasn't necessarily a very young player. This might be normal for someone who's like 10 years old, because we got kids like the ones in here right now who, they could be higher rated than so many, than me when I was 10 for sure, and just have so many talented kids these days that if I'm going to lose to a 1900, I almost expect it to be maybe the next big talent or somebody who's studying chess and up and coming. But it was a guy who just, probably had an office job back home, and on his spare time, he just beats GMs, apparently. So I wasn't aware of that, but he destroyed me in this game, and very memorable for me, very bad memory for me. I don't know if I can go so far as to say I look back and laugh at it, but at least I can look back at it, with both eyes open now. So yeah, this was quite a bad loss that I suffered at a very big tournament, very big stage. Thankfully for me, I recovered my tournament with some wins near the end, but this one will never really be forgotten. Definitely one of the lowest ratings I've ever lost to in terms of difference between my rating, it's a point differential, and especially since becoming a GM, like I was saying earlier, you never expect to have such a big upset loss, right after you become a GM. It's like you join the club and everyone's like, welcome, and then you go out there and you lose to a 1900 and they want to kick you out again. So this was a pretty bad game that I suffered. But I have another one that I wanted to share with you as well. Yeah.
This was your first ever Olympiad?
This was not my first ever Olympiad, but it was my first ever Olympiad as a Grandmaster. So I had played in the Olympiad in 2014 in Tromsø for Team Canada when I was in IM, and I had coached the women's team for Team Canada in 2016, and so this was the first Olympiad that I played as a GM, let's say. So another reason that it's not a good way to start off. Not a good way to start off.
So after this, have you ever played c4 as white?
Maybe I'm too scared to play c4 again. Well, technically the answer to your question is actually probably no, because I just haven't played that much at all.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not because I'm too scared to play it, but the answer is actually yes, I haven't played it since then. So maybe subconsciously I'm just too afraid to do it again, especially against the 1900. maybe I feel now more confident against GMs than I do against 1900s as a result of this scarring memory. But, you know, losing with the white pieces is another thing that most high-rated players consider to be a big advantage. The Maroczy bind, also one of the most favored openings for white. So, you know, when I lost this game, I just didn't have many excuses. Like, I guess I was tired. I don't know. Like, I'm running out of things to say. But it was a very well-played game by my opponent. Usually you expect a 1900 to make a mistake at some point, but he just never seemed to. So I made more mistakes than him, and yeah, he definitely deserved it. So yeah, but yeah, I have another game of mine, which you can imagine I'm brimming with enthusiasm to show you. This game happened in 2015, so this was before I was a Grandmaster, and I was actually playing a Grandmaster. I was playing Alexander Donchenko. That's a Grandmaster from Germany. He's a fairly young Grandmaster. Him and I have actually played a few times in our careers, and that's just because I have played some tournaments in Europe, and I've sort of crossed paths with him at various open tournaments and such. And we always seem to meet in the tournament when, you know, maybe I'm off to a good start, or maybe whenever I really need a point, I always seem to meet this particular Grandmaster, Alexander Donchenko. You can see here, he's 2588, but he hovers around 2600, and he's younger than myself, so very, very talented player. There's a lot of young GMs from Germany that are studying chess together and working quite hard, traveling for it. And I played him in a tournament in France called the Vandoeuvre Open. And this was in 2015, like I said, so not incredibly recent, but still a game that I remember. Now, I was playing black in this game. He started with c4, and I actually, at the time, had this c5 move that I play. But like I said, my opponent and I had actually met in a few tournaments already, so some of the opening is a little bit of sort of psychology that he knew maybe what I had already played, and maybe we've already had a game here. And what he decided to go for was a line where he knows that I maybe was going to play the hedgehog. I was. And in some of the hedgehog lines where you play knight f3 early, black can really quickly put a bishop on b7. So I think he knew this about my repertoire at the time, and he played very quickly g3, bishop g2. So he didn't let that happen. Not that this is like how to beat the opening or something, but specifically it was like how to beat my opening. So I always put my bishop on b7 pretty early, and I found it annoying when players did this. So, and he did that. So obviously he had done some research and some preparation. So he goes for this move d4. If you don't play d4, in some cases I might play the move d4. And the reason he's doing so is to create a position where I'm probably going to be saddled with an isolated pawn no matter what. And the play continued like this, knight f3. Usually, whether it's white or black who has these pawns, what you do is you follow up with this bishop move, because one of a couple things is going to happen. First of all, knight c3 is not possible. We can see this. Bishop d2 is going to mean that I play a move like bishop c5, and then all of a sudden your queen is not attacking the pawn anymore. So I'm like coaxing your bishop to go to a square that maybe it doesn't want to be on. If knight d2, well, then I don't even have to move my bishop again. It's not attacked. And the queen is not attacking the pawn. So for a couple reasons, bishop b4 is a very standard type of move here. Okay, he goes with knight bd2. Knight c6, so guarding my pawn, also guarding my bishop. Sometimes we might worry that, you know, that bishop's a little loose to maybe some tactic like that. But knight c6, nice solid move. a3, makes sense, hits the bishop. And I wanted to bring my bishop back to a square where it was always going to protect the pawn on d4. Now, am I expecting to hang on to this pawn for the rest of the game? Not really. You know, that white is going to eventually play bishop here, knight here, unleash the queen, the knight, and the bishop, plus all the other pieces in the position. I mean, I'm not hanging onto that pawn forever, but I am going to hang on to it as long as I can without making any bad moves in my position. So this is what I did here. He played bishop takes d4. I played rook e8. And it was around here, castles, bishop g4, where I thought that I have a reasonable position. Although these pieces might get traded, I thought that despite my isolated pawn, I have good pressure on the e-file. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is I'm trading so many pieces, right? The more you trade, even though I might have this weakness, the closer we get to an endgame, maybe a rook endgame, something like that, is it really going to be enough to lose the game? That's the question. And at the time, and even now, I think the answer is just no. So I was feeling pretty confident here. Queen d3, queen e7. So I gave him a chance to double my pawns here. That might not look very normal. One of the reasons I did was because this pawn is not on b2. Now, if it was on b2, then I think I have a horrible position. Very, very bad. The reason that this is even playable, at least in my head, was that this rook is always going to be attacking a3, and that's a given for the rest of the game, which means he's always going to have a rook or a queen, something protecting that pawn on a3, and I can meanwhile shift my rook away from the pawn, go back to it whenever I want, and it just always has to be watched over. So that was my compensation for these double pawns here, was that a3 was always under attack. And in the meantime, I have pressure on e2 here, so my opponent has to do something about that. And at the time, I thought, well, if he plays e3, then maybe I have this move, queen e4. So I'm attacking two pieces here, and I'm encouraging him to take me on e4 so that I can take back with one or more, with the pawn, with the knight, it doesn't matter. And I thought that, let's say, a position like this, let's say rook c8, would actually be quite decent for me because I'm threatening to play like rook c3 or just get my pieces in the position. And he can't necessarily play, well, maybe he can, but it looks not necessarily clear, rook c1, because once again, I might take that and take on a3. And this is what I was referring to earlier. So that rook always has that open file. So I thought that was good compensation. Even if my pawns don't look very good, I thought that open file must be worth something. I sort of overlooked h3 at the time, I have to admit. Not that it's a move that, wow, brilliancy, I totally missed it. But I just sort of overlooked it in my calculation that he can throw this move in and that it makes a difference because if I go into any of the lines I just looked at, all the queen e4 moves, if my bishop's not attacking the knight, they're not the same. So if my bishop goes back here, which it did, then e3, queen e4 is not quite the same as it was in the other position, although it's still fine. And the reason it's not quite the same is my opponent can actually play queen d1. In the previous position, with the bishop here, walking into that pin, well, that does not seem right. That does not seem right at all. But now that the bishop's kicked out, queen d1 was actually possible, and I guess I hadn't really anticipated that. But I still think it was a fine position. Now, I still, in this case, have this rook on a8 hitting that pawn. I thought that I have the other open file, and I might stick a knight on e4, very hard to kick out. f3 always hangs the pawn, and otherwise he never wants to give up his bishop for the knight. That's not what white wants to do. His king would be too weak. So I still thought, that my pawns look very, very bad, very ugly, but good position. Must be a good position. Knight on e4, and I thought, okay, let's trade. If we traded everything, he's not going to play this move, but if he did, I would be hitting this pawn, so I wouldn't just be losing a pawn on e4, and I also have control over the open file, so I'm the one who can enter the position whenever I want. So he decided to play rook c2, and after takes, queen c8, again, I'm renewing this threat as well as offering a trade, sort of forcing him to take and go into this endgame. And at this point, probably when I was playing the game, I didn't really realize that this would be in one of my greatest losses lectures. Now, looking back, that's quite sad because I think what we're looking at here is a position which I wouldn't consider completely equal, but based on the way that I handled it and the way that I played, I thought that I was almost cruising towards a draw. I thought that although my pawns are very weak, if we look at what happens, I just bring the king into the middle. And from here, it was very hard for me to see how white makes progress. Because what I want to do is play g5, which I did, fix these pawns like this. I like g5 because it's on a dark square. We both, my opponent and I, have light squared bishops. So good rule for endgames. Not that it's always true, but often true. Put your pawns on the opposite color of your opponent's bishop. especially if you both have the same color bishop and everyone's moving on light squares. If your pawns are all on dark squares, then you never have to worry about defending them. So that's my logic there. If the knight went to f5, I was probably going to take it. So I felt like if I traded bishop for knight, that's good for me. I felt like if I traded almost any piece, that was good for me. But what I ended up doing was, I thought, quite good. Whenever you're in a, let's say, slightly worse position, especially in an endgame, it's a really good idea to trade pawns when you can. Trading the pawns liquidates the position. It's very hard to win with reduced pawns on the board, because sometimes it may come down to, oh, you only have one pawn, I'll just sacrifice my piece for it, and then you can't win. So the more pawns traded, the better. And although he's got nice looking pawns, nice position, I didn't actually see how he breaks through, because my plan is simple. I want to play king here and f5 and trade everything, and then go into a pawn endgame and say, okay, it's just over. It should be a draw. And unfortunately for him, there's not much he can do about that. Although these pawns look weak, he can't attack them. That's what's so frustrating. The knight is controlled nicely by this bishop. Sort of every square it would want to go that's forward progress. If knight b3, let's imagine, right? There's just no getting into any of the squares you want. How do I attack b6? There's no good way. a4 is protected, c4 is not possible. Hard to get the move f4 in. Always drops the pawn anyway. So in this position, he played knight e2, but after f6, he goes back to d4. It was clear that there wasn't really a plan for white. And that's fine. Sometimes you're in an endgame, it might be better for you, but it's just not winning. And I felt like that's what this was. So it was kind of like, if I lost the game, maybe I wouldn't be too surprised, as long as he did it in a nice way. Maybe he shows some technique in the endgame, outplayed me. But I thought that I could get away with all these weaknesses, but simply trading material down. And I pretty much did so perfectly. And the reason that I took with the bishop is that if I took with the knight, I just did not want to allow the option for him to play a position where he's got a nice knight against a bad bishop, where the bishop, like we were talking about, can't attack any of these pawns because they're all sitting on dark squares. So I thought, okay, what's perfect for me is taking with the bishop, because if he takes with his knight and we get a sort of imbalance here, I'm comfortable with this because I'm hitting his pawn here, and I wasn't sure that he could go for this. So what that means is that if I start by taking with the bishop, actually the most likely situation is he just has to take me, let's say. And so at this position, I had actually sort of reached this position in my head and realized that my pawn on b6 is actually fantastically placed. Because if king d4, king e6, and there's no invading here. There's no king to c5. And let's say if a4, to play a5 and try to get king c5, then I thought, well, king d6, a5, I could take, I could push, let's say takes. One thing I thought about this position is that, yes, white is just going to play this, or king b6, let's say, and win the game. So I have to be careful about that. But let's say here, king e6. After this, if after a5 I play b5, then it would be white's turn in this position. The reason that maybe taking is wrong is because then it's my turn. So here, if he plays e4, I would take, king takes, or king e6 rather. And wherever his king goes, I just sort of follow him. If he plays f4, then the issue that I saw was that I could play a move like g4. And I would get my king here and use the d4 move to break up these pawns. Like this. And surprisingly, actually, black is winning this endgame. So let's say if he tries to win, he plays f4, he runs into this. And I had calculated this. But he didn't play king d4. Actually, he spent sort of a long time here, because actually there's only king and pawns on the board. It's not much to think about. You can only move so many pieces, right? I mean, calculate your king moves, calculate your only legal or decent pawn moves, and there you go. You've analyzed the whole position. So he probably saw king d4 and saw what variations we just looked at on the board and said, okay, they don't win. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play this move. So I'm going to see what my opponent does. Maybe he finds that it's just equal, and maybe we go into this. So here, if I had played, let's say, king f6, we would transpose after king d4 to king e6, right? Because last time we played king from here to here and king from there to there. So zigzagging like that, it's the same for both of us. So if I wanted to transpose, I should have probably played that. I think at the time I was maybe a little concerned about this and how if I got this position that he could waste the move and maybe it would be my turn. But it's not really a problem, as after this, for him to go for my pawns, I also get his pawn and make a queen of my own. That's another race for another time, but certainly something that I was concerned about playing king f6. So I thought, okay, he shuffled, I'm going to play king e5, and then after king c3, I'll go back to king f5. So I played king e5, and I think this is one of the only times that I've seen an opponent do a fist bump with his eyes. So after king e5, he was so happy because he has the move f4 in this position, which I resigned after this move. Because it looks like an impossible move, maybe, but quite simply, he takes my pawn, and then he's first to get here and take the rest of the pawns. And so it's just lost all of a sudden. Because remember in the past, I was saying that wherever my king was, it would be somewhere not check. After f4, I was saying g4 was my move. I was always ready to play g4. But I sort of played king e5 without thinking too much. I will also add a footnote that we're on move 43. So this is even worse for me because we've already hit time control. So I wish that I lost this game on move 39 or something more respectable. But move 43 indicates that I just got extra time and didn't use it. So it's even worse for me. We're not looking good here on the PR side. King e5, f4, just game over. I have to take. If I don't, and I go king here, well, he just takes here, and he's just first again, everywhere. So it came all the way down to king and pawn endgame. It's kind of an important tournament for me. Of course, I was going for the GM title. This was a GM norm tournament, and it all came down, not like the penultimate round or the anything like that. This is just round 4, but I was off to a good start, obviously, since I was playing a strong player, and this really just sort of set me back in the tournament. And okay, obviously, I never ended up making a norm in this tournament. Didn't go that well, but just these tough defeats that the whole game it's maybe equal or slightly worse, but should be a draw. And then one move without thinking at the end, king e5, and you can just resign with f4. So it's just such a shock that I thought, because I was expecting to draw this entire game. It was not my game plan going in, but the way the pieces were being traded, I thought, okay, I have a bad pawn structure, but shouldn't be an issue. I'll be able to make a draw here with some weak pawns and sort of fight for that equality, because I'm not down any material, and unless you make so many weaknesses, it's kind of hard to lose a game when you're not down material. But that's why I'm here to tell you that I found a way. I found the way to do that. I lost without being down material. So I actually resigned in a position, a king and pawn endgame with equal material. That's a it's a great loss. That's a very memorable loss, and definitely something that I've sort of reminded me to always take your time in those endgames where it looks so completely simple. There's only king and pawns on the board, but all that means when there's few pieces on the board is that your mistakes are magnified, 100 times. That one wrong move is just game over. When there's a bunch of pieces on the board, you can make a blunder when you can keep playing. I mean, it's not game over maybe after that blunder. You might be worse, but then you can try to fight back. There's often no fighting back from mistakes in king and pawn endgames. Those mistakes are the ones that, the person who doesn't have a heart rate, that's like 0.00, and then you make a bad move and then just they come alive like some Frankenstein or something. Those are the bad moves, and they always happen in endgames. So this was another quite poor loss of mine that, okay, I just had to live with. I resigned on the spot, and yeah, this was against Alexander Donchenko. So just messing up in a simple position against a strong player is always a tough feeling, because when you play those guys that are higher rated than you, that's when you want to score those wins, get those points, draw, whatever it is, just demonstrate that you can play at a higher level. And this demonstrated that I was nowhere close to that level. So a tough loss to take. And yeah, both of these games today, I guess, were losses in very different ways, but both of them were quite impactful on me, and I still remember them. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this class, guys.